Right, okay, let's talk more about political parties, shall we? Because it will not have escaped our listeners' attention that we have Andy and Murdo reunited in conversation, having tried to blow up the Conservative Party not that long ago. Murdo, do you want to just explain why you don't like
And they
the
got away
party?
with it too, had it not been for you pesky kids.
Do you want to explain why it is you dislike the party of which you remember so much that you think it should be abolished?
Well, that's a very hostile way of putting the question, Calum, if I may say so. I think so. My argument at the time, this was back in 2011. I mean, it's a long time ago now. But for most of the 20th century, there was no Conservative Party in Scotland. We had something called the Scottish Unionist Party, which was formed in 1912, brought together people from the Liberal Unionists and the Conservatives, and was very successful. In fact, the only party ever in Scotland's history to achieve an overall majority of votes in a general election, I think in 1955. And in 1965, after an election defeat, Ted Heath came along and thought it would be a good idea not to have a separate Scottish Unionist Party, but to, in effect, fold that into the Conservative Party. And of course, Unionist MPs like famously Alec Douglas-Hume as Prime Minister had been part of the parliamentary party at Westminster. And it seemed to me that having that distinct brand in Scotland actually was to our electoral benefit. And I think the thing has been quite interesting. Even in the last week, I've had 3 different conversations with people, either on the doorsteps or just people I've met in parliamentary meetings and so on, who've all said to me, the general election is interesting. There are different messages coming from the Scottish Conservatives, from the UK Conservatives. We see the Scottish Conservative brand as being distinct from the UK Conservative brand. So already, if you like, that distinctiveness exists and has existed for a while. And I think having a Scottish Conservative brand that is more distinct from the UK party is a positive for us. And there are people in Scotland I meet all the time who say, we quite like what the Scottish Conservatives do. We wouldn't necessarily vote Conservative if we lived in England, but in Scotland we quite like what you say and what you stand for. So I think this is about building on what people already perceive around the Conservatives in Scotland.
It's interesting, Liz, I suppose, because based on what Murdo said and hearing what Murdo said, trying to understand, trying to convey the role of a Scottish Conservative Party, because the historic implication of that is it sort of jars. Do you know what I mean? That's the perception, that Scottish and Conservative are kind of always at odds with each other. But how do you see the kind of role of the party of which you remember?
Well, I think it's very important in Scotland that we have a very distinctive Scottish identity, but that is not mutually exclusive to being British. And I think that, it was interesting when the census came out, actually, about some of the how people identify themselves these days. And obviously that there's a rising percentage of people who see themselves as Scottish, and the British aspect is less important to some people. I think that's a strong message for us as unionists, that if we are going to be strong unionists, we have to be in a position where we put forward policies that show that Scotland is absolutely integral to the success of the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom government also has to accept that Scotland is an integral part to its success. And particularly since the 2014 referendum, as I say, we've always had this sort of constitutional bickering, and I think it's been a difficult sell at times, because people are sort of see the UK Tories and they see the Scottish Tories and they don't always think that we're together. And yet we are, as unionists, and on so many aspects of reserved policy. But I think, the whole point of devolution is that we have distinctive policies when it comes to education, to justice, to a whole lot of aspects of the economy, and an increasing degree of tax autonomy as well. So I think, it's our role to be positive about what we think we stand for, not what we're against, which is pretty obvious, I think that there's a growing number of people in the electorate who want to know, what is it that the Scottish Tories stand for? What are you going to do for me as a Scottish citizen? Because I know you're against the whole aspect of independence, but that's not a good reason for voting Tory. I want people to vote Tory because they think it's the right thing for their future and for the future of their children.
I mean, if we go back to, I think it's important to go back to 2011, and I always have paid tribute to Murdo and Liz because I helped them and I tried to make this happen for reasons I'll explain in a second. But it was really easy for me sitting behind a keyboard to do that. Right, it's not hard. It was much more difficult for Murdo and Liz to do something which is, without question, the most radical platform that any Conservative politician in Scotland has stood on, certainly in the devolved era and probably for quite a long time before that as well. It was an enormous thing to do, and it's a real tribute to Murdo and Liz that they led it and did it, and almost won. Can we also remember? Wasn't that far off.
Yeah.
The reason that I was involved and the reason that I thought it was an important thing to do is because I am loyal to centre-right free market liberalism, and I'm not loyal to political parties. I don't care about the Conservative Party, never have. Doesn't interest me. It's a vehicle for power. That's all. It's all I ever view political parties as, and that's what I think they should be. And when the vehicle to get your ideology into power is written off, you have to get a new one. And that is what, for me, 2011 was about, because the vehicle, in my view at the time, was written off, and it was never possible for the Conservative Party to be in government in Scotland. Fundamentally, I think nothing has changed at all. We went through this period in the post-referendum era where the Tories were polling in the mid-20s and doing very well. And still, as we speak today, still have 31 seats in the Scottish Parliament and are the official opposition in the Scottish Parliament. But that was all built not on ideology, but on unionism, on identity, as I said earlier on in the podcast. That's what all of that is built on. And you can see from the vote share polling that it is entirely possible that's all about to fall apart again, and the party will be back to where it was in 2011 and 2007 and 2003 and 1999. And these arguments will have to be replayed. And ultimately, I keep asking myself the question, why is Scotland different from every other country in Europe, including the Scandinavians, who will very often return a centre-right government? Very often. Why is Scotland the only country in all of Europe that doesn't, won't, and I would argue can't, return a centre-right government? And the answer to that question is because the centre-right party is the Scottish Conservative Party. And that, for me, is simply not going to change. And that's why I have never changed my mind. I've changed my mind about the structure. I think the structure now is Canada. And we've talked here a bit about the Union and the preserving the UK and all that sort of stuff. There's nobody in Quebec talking about independence right now. It's dead. It is utterly dead in Quebec. Even the Bloc Québécois, they don't even talk about it because they know it's dead too. So Quebec is run by a variety of people, some of whom believe and would answer yes in a sovereignty referendum in Quebec, and some of whom wouldn't. But critically, Quebec now is increasingly run by parties of the centre-right. There is no reason that Scotland can be any different. It can do that with separate political parties and still be part of actually a strengthened UK. This argument, frankly, isn't going to go away. It's just the same as it always was before.
Well, Andy, pick up something. I mean, I think I've reflected on this a lot, obviously, over the last decade or so. I think you're right about Canada. You know, I think one of the issues we were faced with, people said, well, how can you be the party of the Union and argue for separate representation in Scotland? And actually, I think the idea that if you live in Scotland, you should be able to vote for a UK party that will form the UK government actually is a really important principle. So the UK Conservative Party could, under the Canadian model, would still fight elections in Scotland, but they just wouldn't fight elections to Holyrood. And I suppose if you reflect back to 1997 and 1999, that period, with hindsight, there was nothing automatic about the fact that the existing political parties who existed UK-wide would fight the Holyrood elections. That happened in effect by accident, because they were the only institutions that had the resource and the mechanism and the networks to fight those elections. What we could have seen and perhaps should have seen are new different political parties coming forward in 1999. They would have a different platform that wouldn't be tied to the existing parties. But that ship has sailed. I suppose the other interesting thought looking ahead is, and we've had this conversation already about the cultural divide in Scottish politics around the Constitution. So if that, so that will be resolved, in one of two ways. It'll either be resolved because we get independence. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. Or it'll be resolved because, a bit like Quebec, people just accept independence isn't happening anytime soon, and therefore it goes away as a conversation point. Now, let's imagine, looking ahead in Scotland, independence stops being an issue. Would people like Liz and I look at somebody like, say, Kate Forbes in the SNP and find many issues we would disagree with Kate Forbes on if you take the Constitution out of the question? And the answer is actually no. There are probably a lot of issues where we would have very strong common ground with Kate Forbes. So could you see politicians like us working with a party led by Kate Forbes? Might not be the SNP, it might be a different party. And a moderate, centre-right coalition coming forward to take Scotland forward. Yeah, that's entirely possible. But it only happens if the Constitution stops being the dominant issue in Scotland.
Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.